Welcome to the channel, guys. Today we're going to be having a talk about clone houses and what I think of them, so stay tuned for that. And if you like the content, guys, hit that like and subscribe button. I really do appreciate it. Now, before we get into the actual discussion, I'm going to define clone houses, and a clone house is essentially a fragrance brand that imitates other fragrances. They will create lower cost versions of other fragrances. And a lot of people do have problems with these. They consider it to be theft, or they think of it as cutting into the profits. At least with respect to cutting into profits, you look at these companies, these high-end niche fragrances, you look at Dior and Chanel, and a lot of these houses have numerous clones made after a lot of their popular fragrances, and they are still multi-billion-dollar companies, or at least multi-million-dollar companies. These companies build a huge amount of money, and honestly, I don't think, or from what I can gather, that it actually hurts the quality of life of any of the perfumers or any of the fragrance houses. So on that particular aspect, I actually don't mind it. I don't really think that it's a big problem. The other thing to think about is that while clone houses may explicitly imitate other fragrances, there are definitely popular brands that do the exact same thing, and this happens a lot. You'll see people releasing their version of another fragrance. A really good example of this is Prada Luna Rossa Carbon and Dior Sauvage EDP. If you actually spray those and compare them side by side, you are going to have a very hard time telling them apart. I mean, the biggest difference for me is that Sauvage is a bigger projector. So, it is nice that Carbon is a little quieter. Sometimes you want something a little quieter, but ultimately they smell very, very similar. And a lot of fragrance houses do exactly that. And people oftentimes even ask or look for explicitly niche versions of other fragrances. So people often talk about Naxos as being a niche version of Pure Havane, or Rehab being a niche version of Spice Bomb. And ultimately, that really makes you wonder if they're actually original or interpretations or clones, if you really want to think about it that way. So even within the actual brands that are recognized as brands, ultimately, I think there's a lot of inspiring that goes on and a lot of borrowing other people's DNA, especially if they're very, very popular. Now, on another point, the real question, or at least one of the things that I find, a lot of times there's fragrances that are absolutely amazing, and for whatever reason, they don't perform well on my skin. A couple good examples of that is Erolfa by Creed. I think it's one of the best, if not the best, aquatic fragrance I've ever smelled. And Elysium by Roja Parfums. Both of these are amazing fragrances, and both these I really would consider buying, but they perform absolutely horribly on my skin. I get maybe 4 hours, maybe a little bit more if I'm lucky. And Elysium is essentially a skin scent on me, almost from the moment you spray it. I get maybe an hour or so. And with the price point that you're paying, it's just not that great. However, I do find a lot of times with the inspirations or the clones that they do perform better. So Aquatica is a great example of that. For Erolfa, and Zion by Alexander Fragrances is also a good example for Elysium. Both of those fragrances perform better, so I actually get some longevity from them. I actually get some projection. I feel like I get value, and honestly, for both of those fragrances, if they performed more like the inspirations, I might be more tempted to shell out the money and to actually buy them. But with the cost proposal over $200, you can get them cheaper on the gray market, but it just doesn't make sense. It's hard to justify something that lasts for such a short time and you can barely smell it unless you're burying your nose into your arm. So that is another thing that I find is nice about these clone houses. Another thing that I think is nice to have is some of these fragrances are not only very expensive, but very, very hard to get. A good example of this is Italica. Now, I love this fragrance. I loved it so much that I wanted to get a bottle. The thing is that not only is it 275 pounds if you pay retail, but you have to basically be in the UK to get it. I think there might be some areas in the EU that you can also get this fragrance, but you have to go to Harvey Nichols to get it. And if you can find someone selling it, on the gray market, usually you actually end up paying more money than the actual retail because it's such a hard item to get. So I know people that have paid $400 for a bottle. I mean, I paid for this at retail and I managed to get it with the exchange rate at about $3.25 because I loved it. But again, it's such a hard to find fragrance and so expensive that it's one of these fragrances that makes a lot of sense to have an inspiration of. So there is one from Alexandria Fragrances. I really do want to check that one out. There's one from Genre as well that I also really enjoy. And I just think it makes sense in this context where you have hard to get fragrances that are made a lot more available. So I think that's another nice thing about them. Some inspiration houses also clone discontinued fragrances, and this is something that also makes sense to me too, because a lot of the times fragrances are discontinued for one reason or another. The company may not see the money value behind continuing to have the fragrance available, or maybe something an ingredient became hard to get and they no longer really could produce the fragrance. And a lot of these inspiration houses manage to produce really, really close facsimiles. And for people who absolutely love these discontinued fragrances that they just can't get anymore, this is a great, great alternative. And I think they're doing a good service to a lot of people who fell in love with fragrances that are just not available anymore. So also from that respect, I think that they're great. Kind of on a final note here, I think everyone should have the option to smell good if they want. Ultimately, you know, a lot of people may love something like Black Phantom. I love Black Phantom. I love it so much I bought a bottle of it. But it's over $200. And for a lot of people, they have families or they have other responsibilities, and spending that kind of money on a fragrance doesn't make sense. But if they are able to buy a inspiration, they can still smell like one of their favorite fragrances and still save that money for something that they need it for a lot more than a fragrance. Now, I mean, falling in line with the whole business thing, ultimately, I don't think that does impact sales a lot, because for a lot of people, they love the fragrance a lot and they find they just want the original either for the presentation or to support the brand, or because there's always that little something that makes it just a little bit different than the interpretations. And people still buy the original formulations in, you know, huge enough numbers that these companies are still making a lot of money. So ultimately, I think it's fantastic, and I don't have a problem with clone houses. I think everyone should have the right to smell really good if they want, and not everyone has the kind of money to be spending even $100 on a bottle of perfume, right? So you got to take that into consideration. I also love that a lot of these inspiration houses come out with really fantastic original fragrances, which otherwise may not have hit the market. So Genre Parfums has Voodoo, is my favorite from the house so far. And Alexandria has a ton of originals that I really enjoy as well. So anyways, guys, I think I'm going to end it there. That's my thought on clone houses. Ultimately, short answer, I like them. I think they're fantastic. What do you think about them? Leave a comment down below. And as always, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next video.